I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is Jim and
Jim and
Garrett
Garrett
at
at the
the
movies.
Movies. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Jim and Garrett at the Movies. We will be talking about we'll be covering the first Netflix film that we've ever covered. It's Triple Frontier. We'll also be talking about, on our movie club segment, we'll be talking about Three Kings, and we'll cover the James Gunn return story, the triumphal return of James Gunn. So first, Triple Frontier. This is a rather complex. It starts to be a guys on a mission story. I think there are a little bit more complex themes to it, but basically, it's a guys on a mission story where five guys, five ex-military, go to take down a drug kingpin and steal his fortune. It stars Ben Affleck, Oscar Isaac, Charlie Hunnam, Garrett Hudlin, and Pedro Pascal as the five guys on a mission. It is directed by J.C. Candor and co-written by Mark Boal of Zero Dark 30 and The Hurt Locker fame. So this film was released on Netflix not too long ago. We had a chance to take a look at it. What did you think, Garrett?
Well, I think that in many ways, this might be the best pairing that we've had in the history of this podcast, because I think Triple Frontier and Three Kings are similar but different in so many ways.
Right.
We'll talk about Three Kings, of course, more depth, and when we get to that, we'll pay more direct attention to the to the contrasts. But I'll start by sort of stating what I think the strengths of Triple Frontier are. I think the chemistry between the five main cast members, I think, is really good, really solid. I felt that they definitely felt like they were brothers in arms, like they had a history together, that they cared about each other, and that they sort of both cooperated with each other and worked together, but also had their own internal tensions and internal conflicts. So the casting overall was solid. The chemistry between them was good. The action events I thought were well done, both in terms of the beats and to how they came in throughout the film, and also just in terms of their choreography, the cinematography. There were some really nice shots, both sort of several aerial helicopter shots, as well as some sort of nice, just sort of slow motion bits here and there. And I think the core premise is a compelling one. There's been, I think, a good rash of movies recently about, sort of hardworking, working class guys who have been down on their luck, shit on by the man, and so they're gonna fight back and they're gonna take what's theirs for once. But rather than like robbing a bank or something like that, which other movies have done, they're gonna rob one of the major drug cartels. So all those elements I thought were strong. Where the film, I think, failed to sort of deliver was sort of in sort of the substance of that. It felt pretty paint by numbers, I thought, once you sort of got into the meat of it. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was completely predictable, but I was never really surprised either. Everything played out more or less the way I anticipated it would, and it wasn't so enrapturing and so engaging that I just didn't care that I was along for the ride. I wouldn't say so much that I've seen this movie before, but I felt like I'd seen it before I saw it anyway.
Sure. I can agree with a lot of what you said there, especially about the performances. I like Oscar Isaac in this film quite a bit. Ben Affleck is also there. But I think Oscar Isaac sort of does a lot of the complexity of the character, and the complexity of the role that his character plays in the film. What's at issue here is I think that in the first act we get some interesting themes about both American imperialism, as it relates to the quote unquote war on drugs, and the effects of fighting, the effects of war on fighting men and what it does to who they are and what they become after they return from the front lines. All of that is set up in the first act, and this is really Mark Boal's, this is his happy zone. Like, these are the types of characters that he writes really well. These are the types of characters that he is able to imbue with a certain degree of honesty and a certain degree of it feels like he knows these people. And so that first act, I was kind of in on a lot of the character interactions and how these characters would play out over the rest of the thing, over the rest of the film. The problem is once we get into the second act and once the guys actually go on the mission, all of that character stuff, or the vast majority of that character stuff, disappears. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was this film begins with a character standing in front of an American flag, and he's framed in this really heroic way, and he's talking about, like, that's what you do when you're a warrior. And I'm like, oh my fucking God, what are we about to, like, is this some, is this going to be some super nationalist thing, or is there going to be some complexity to it? And of course, he speaks out against private corporations sort of hiring ex-military for their sort of mercenary work. And then of course we see him become that character, that mercenary, being hired by the Oscar Isaac character. And at that point, I was expecting there to be some sort of interesting character play about that internal contradiction of this is the bullshit that he's forced to say, and yet this is who he has to be as driven by circumstances. And so I was really interested in that internal character conflict. Problem is that internal character conflict didn't really go anywhere. So I was in on the first act, but then the second and third act kind of lost me, and it just became a rather paint by numbers guys on a mission film.
So I thought I was a little puzzled by that, because I thought that Charlie Hunnam's character's speech at the beginning was fantastic. I thought it was great, but you hampered down on something very different than me. You hampered down on that's what you do when you're a warrior. For me, it hampered down on the line he said, where he said that committing violence has a physiological and anatomical effect on the human body.
Sure.
And yeah, that immediately brought to mind The Hurt Locker. And I think The Hurt Locker, I mean, it's Mark Bowles again, but that's a film I think that played with this stuff a lot better than this film did. It managed to carry the themes throughout and not just sort of have it as a window dressing, as it were.
Right.
And again, and since I mentioned Charlie Hunnam, I like him as an actor, but I have to admit that in this film, I couldn't help but continuing to see Jax Teller, the character he played on Sons of Anarchy, which is a show that I really liked. And it's a character I really liked, but seeing that character in this film, and again, it wasn't that much of a stretch. I could actually sort of imagine Jax Teller doing the kind of things that his character did in this film, but it wasn't what they wanted. You know, he didn't shift gears enough out of that old role for this one. And then Pedro Pascal, I think, also deserves some credit. I thought he was quite good, along with Oscar Isaac. You kind of gave a little shade to Affleck, but I thought Affleck was fine in this. I mean, certainly not exemplary, but solid. He played the role that he needed to play. He made it distinctive. The person, and again, this is probably me more than him, but I'm curious for your experience on this one, because I know there's only 5 lead actors in this, and I recognize Pedro Pascal and Charlie Hunnam and Oscar Isaac and Ben Affleck. And every single time Garrett Hedlund shows up on screen, I have to say to myself, is that Garrett Hedlund? Because I've seen him in like at least a half dozen other movies before now. I feel like I should recognize him, but I mean, either he has the world's most unforgettable face, or something about, or the most forgettable face, or something about the patterns of his face just triggers some sort of face blindness in me. Because every time I see him, I forget that I've ever seen him before, even if I'm seeing him just 30 seconds after I saw him previously.
Well, I mean, I can't necessarily say that I had the same experience, but he and Charlie Hunnam sure do look like brothers, and that was they're brothers in the film, and I think that was perfect casting in that sense. I don't know. I saw him in On the Road, where he plays Dean Moriarty, and Neil Cassidy in On the Road, and that was sort of an unforgettable film for me. I really liked that film, and I really liked him in it. And for Charlie Hunnam, I saw The Lost City of Zed, The Lost City of Z, The Lost City of Z. So those, like, I've sort of separated them by their most memorable roles for me. And I never saw Sons of Anarchy, so that's sort of not on my radar. But yeah, I do see what you're saying, and they are kind of. I think they were perfectly cast as brothers, though. That was definitely there was definitely a family resemblance between those two actors. Yeah. So what do you? Any other thing about this film that really highlight? I mean, it seems like I don't have a whole lot to say about this film because it is really quite paint by numbers in its plotting once it gets to the second and third act. And so at that point, it's kind of one of those films that it kind of fades into the guys on a mission genre. And you know, there's a bit of Treasure of Sierra Madre in there, and a bit of, but a lot of all of the guys on a mission films that you've seen before.
There was, I think, some semi-interesting decisions about dealing with some moral complexities and ambiguities. They were generally sort of passed by pretty quickly. They weren't dwelt upon. But I was glad, at least, that the film was at least vaguely conscientious of them. I mean, you mentioned a bit about American imperialism. That wasn't necessarily one that I picked up on. I did wish that they did a little bit more to anchor some of the characters in the countries where they were actually, going, rather than being sort of all American cast, as it were.
Yeah.
But I think, in some ways, I think I want to save some of my comments on this for when we discuss Three Kings, because I wasn't really able to put my finger on it until I saw Three Kings. I think that Three Kings managed a lot of the moral complexities much better than Triple Frontier did.
Yes.
So again, in the interest of sort of maybe sort of passing for now on where it is, I think the Triple Frontier dropped the ball, so we can compare and contrast on how I think Three Kings succeeded where Triple Frontier failed.
Okay, so let's wrap up. What do you give this out of 5?
2.5.
Yeah, that's I'm at 2. I'm at 2 stars out of 5. So it's sort of a recommend for me. But then again, like, this is one of the problems that I have when I review Netflix films, or when I review sort of made for television films, because I do think that there's a different there's a different attitude that I have as a film critic. When I recommend that you go see a film in the theater, I am recommending that you essentially spend you situate your day or evening around this event. Like, we're going to the movies. That's a 3-hour kind of adventure, getting to the theater, buying your popcorn, sitting through the trailer, all of that. Something on Netflix, you could throw it on in the background while you're doing dishes. And so I think there's sort of a different aesthetic, a different set of aesthetic criteria that apply to a Netflix film that don't apply to a theatrical film. And, you know, this does get into some of our conversations that we had a couple weeks ago about privileging theatrical films over Netflix films. So in a way, I have a difficulty in not recommending this film because I don't think it's overly offensive to have on the background while you are doing dishes, or, you know, to have something else going on while you're, you know, doing your laundry or something, which is the way some people consume Netflix media. So I will pretend that this is in the theater and say, I don't recommend that you go spend money on it, but I don't think it's an egregious waste of time. Does that make sense?
See, now I don't share that bivalence on your part. I have the same standard either way, and simple question is, what is it worth your time? Because, I mean, again, maybe it's some privilege for me, but, you know, the money for a ticket for me, at least, is not a huge outputting. And while, yeah, it takes a little bit more time to get to the theater and then to get back, at the end of the day, as I'm getting older, I'm getting much more cognizant of the fact that I only have so many hours left in my life, so many films that I'm going to see. Yeah, you could put it on while washing your dishes, or you could watch something better. That's one of the awesome things about Netflix or YouTube, Hulu, or any of the options is there's just a ridiculous amount of content out there. And so if you're not finding something good, then there's something wrong with your system, because we have an embarrassment of riches right now.
Sure.
So yeah, this falls short of a recommend. I mean, it's not the kind of thing where, I think you should, if your spouse wants to watch it, you should rebel or anything like that. But it's something that I would say probably find something better to do with your time.
Cool. All right, so let's go to something better to do with your time. We'll talk about Three Kings. This is David O. Russell's 1999 film, centers on three, well, technically four, four American servicemen at the end of the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, played by George Clooney, Mark Wahlberg, Ice Cube, and Spike Jonze. They are attempting to steal Kuwaiti gold from Iraqi from Iraqi Republican Guard, and they're going to keep the gold for themselves. And of course, things go wrong. What do you think of? So you wanted to compare some of the aspects of Three Kings to Triple Frontier. How do they compare? What do you think?
Well, since again, I don't want to trash Triple Frontier too much. Let me start by what I think Triple Frontier does better than Three Kings, and that's simply, I think just mostly the technical merits of the film, the direction, the action choreography, the cinematography, the editing choices.
You're talking about Triple Frontier as being superior to Three Kings in all of these ways.
Yes, exactly. I think David O. Russell is a very talented director. I have not seen this movie since it came out. I saw it in 1999 when it came out, and it struck me. I mean, it might be just that these things are dated a little bit. Maybe this is more of a 90s film in terms of its cinematography choices and its technical merits and stuff like that. But a lot of it just felt choppy and a little artless, and sort of poorly executed in terms of, in Three Kings, and so in terms of sort of the basic mechanics of the action sequences and so forth. And I'm not sure if it was the version that I watched was on Hulu, and I kept getting these sort of fade outs that looked like they were supposed to be commercial breaks or something like that.
Yeah, I did too, and that seems like commercial breaks. I mean, it was not edited for television. We got all the bad words that we should get, but it was weird to see those. I don't remember those in the original version, but I do agree with you that like he has fallen in love with slow motion and Dutch angles and low angle shots and sort of some of these hyper saturated colors in some cases, and it's all sort of an attempt to render the hyper reality of war that works in fits and starts. I think some of the shots that he gets are really, really good, but others are just sort of a director showing off.
Yeah, perhaps it's trying too hard to be stylized. I'm not sure, but it did not work for me this time around. Again, I don't remember having that complaint when I saw it originally. But point for point comparisons, I think, yeah, if you look at like the cinematography and the editing and so forth of Triple Frontier, I think Triple Frontier is a better film on those technical merits. That having been said, I think where Three Kings absolutely succeeds in ways where Triple Frontier at best is middling, is the aforementioned moral complexity. I think it does a much better job of showing how fraught warfare can be, how complicated it is. I mean, it starts off in a sort of similar way to Triple Frontier. Hey, there's money here, let's go take it. But the characters in Three Kings start to recognize, wait a minute, that there's other things that matter here, and that they still want the money, but they feel conflicted because in order to get away with the money, they would have to turn their backs on a human rights catastrophe. And so it deals more honestly with that. It shows, I mean, worth not for nothing, it's worth noting that this film came out in 1999, 8 years after the first Gulf War and 3 years before the second Gulf War. And one of the early scenes in Three Kings has George Clooney's character complaining that they left Saddam in power, that they didn't do anything, they pushed him back, and they basically accomplished nothing. Now, again, of course, Clooney is sort of a notorious liberal. I don't know if necessarily that's what he felt about the first Iraq War or not, but in retrospect, at least that's a really ugly thing to hear, because when H.W. Bush's son W. Bush went back into Iraq and deposed Saddam, it became a total fucking mess of a clusterfuck, and things were much worse. So in some ways, the film maybe doesn't age quite so well, being situated between the two wars. But in spite of that fact, I still think it managed to survive precisely because it's not moralizing about the war, and rather it's showing that there are the kinds of moral problems that can arise in war, even though it starts with what's clearly an immoral action, a planned theft on the part of our characters.
Right. And it gets into those moral complexities by actually having the Iraqis be decently well-rounded characters with agency. Decently well-rounded. I don't think that they ever attain like a true three-dimensional character. The Iraqi characters, I don't think they ever really get to the point where they're truly three-dimensional characters, but I do see an attempt to represent multiple sides of a population that has been homogenized by American media. In a lot of ways, we think of Iraq, and in fact, the entire Arab world, as just sort of this amalgamation of either really good Arabs or, terrorists. And that is most definitely not the reality. I lived in Kuwait for 2 months, and there's all spectrums of wonderful and, in some cases not so wonderful people, and it's human beings, and it's a place full of human beings, and so I am glad that the film attempts to represent that, although I don't think it fully succeeds. Where it does, one of the characters who is, of course, probably the most memorable and most prominent is Captain Saeed, and his scenes with Mark Wahlberg are probably the more interesting and more complex scenes in the movie, even though Mark Wahlberg is not necessarily doing. Actually, that is probably the best Mark Wahlberg is in this film, is in those scenes with Captain Saeed, and I mean those torture sequences are actually really quite compelling, and there are degrees to which you can sort of understand the other person's perspective, and I'm actually really quite surprised that David O. Russell was able to capture that as well as he did in parts. Now, the problem is that when the film is finished with that character, the film is definitely finished with that character and doesn't really know how to handle the end of that interpersonal conflict in a organic and character-driven way. So that bothers me, but I do find Captain Saeed to be an interesting character, and I'm gonna butcher his name, and I'm so sorry. The actor's name is Saeed Taghmaoui, I believe. If I mispronounced that, I apologize, sir. But I think he does a fantastic job. Like there are moments where he is really quite chilling, and also brings a great deal of pathos to his performance.
Yeah, I agree. I thought his performance was excellent, and I also agree that concluding that little segment was a difficult thing to do from just a writing point of view. But I do think they managed to transfer that pathos well on to what sort of happens next, the attempt to rescue the refugees. I felt there was a little bit of hand waving that sort of suggested that all that really needed to happen was for these refugees to get across the border into Iran, as if a bunch of Iraqi refugees would be welcomed with open arms in Iran. I mean, I'm sorry, that's just highly improbable.
Right.
But not again. You're trying to tell a story. You can't cover every single complexity. But again, in contrast to what happens in Triple Frontier, I never felt that there was too much of a reckoning of the cost of greed in Triple Frontier.
Yes.
There was a little bit of it. Again, they weren't completely immune to it, but by the end of Triple Frontier, you get the idea that pursuing the money was still basically a righteous action. Whereas at the end of Three Kings, you get the sense that they grew and they developed and they made, spoilers, they decide to turn away the gold, to turn over the gold in order to try to save people. And that was clearly the righteous action. And so, again, but it managed to do it not in a moralizing way or in a saccharine way. I felt it was a sort of natural evolution from the character's point of view. It made sense that they would make that decision. And importantly, I think it's the right decision, and it has sort of moral weight and moral gravity to it in the way that Triple Frontier, again, didn't completely fail to have, but didn't really deal with in the way I think that a superior film like Three Kings managed to pull off.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and a lot of that moral complexity rests on George Clooney's shoulders, and I think he carries it off really quite well. He gives a really good performance under circumstances, which, if you know anything about the production of this film, which were really quite difficult for him, he and David O. Russell famously did not get along at all, constantly at each other's throats.
You, Mark Wahlberg, must have hit it off like gangbusters, because this was the first of like 3 or 4 films that they made together.
Yeah. Mark Wahlberg does his best work under David O. Russell and Paul Thomas Anderson, Boogie Nights and this film and The Fighter. And although there are times, there's a moment after he gets out of the cell where he's just acting like crazy Mark Wahlberg, which is kind of hand waved away in the next scene, and it is the most quintessential Mark Wahlberg. If you want to work on your Mark Wahlberg impression, just watch that moment of this film. It's like, hey, how are you, everybody? I'm happy to be out of here. How's your mother? So he's I probably wasn't annoyed by it in 1999, but I sure as hell was annoyed by it in 2019 when I'm listening to Mark Wahlberg do Mark Wahlberg things.
And let's pay some attention really quickly to, I think, an excellent performance from Spike Jonze. Famous for music video director and also a film director in his own right, making lots of really good movies. I don't think he's done much acting, but I think is really good in this, playing someone who is, the ugly American, for lack of a better word, not a bad guy, but just clearly ignorant. He doesn't understand the mission. He doesn't understand, his host country. He says and does several things which are just incredibly harmful and bad for, just the American presence there in Iraq. And in many ways, if you're looking not necessarily for a villain character, but for the most sort of contemptible of the characters, it's probably Spike Jonze's Conrad Vig. But again, it's not really his fault. You see a little bit of his background. You see that he's ignorant and uneducated, and he's just trying to do the best he can with what he has, which then sort of underscores sort of the moral complexity of it. Yeah, there's a lot of Americans out there who don't understand anything at all about the Middle East. I mean, not that I'm an expert or anything like that, but they see Arabs and they think, yeah, all Arabs think that America's the great Satan. And there's this wonderful scene where he asks one of the Iraqis, "You think America's the great Satan?" And he's just like, "What? No, I want to open a hair salon. What are you talking about?"
And then he makes fun of his haircut.
Yeah, it was again a funny scene, and sort of enlightening scene. It's one of those things you hope, again, obviously he's a fictional character. You hope the character walks away from that, and anyone who sees the movie who may have had a similar attitude walks away from that recognizing, okay, I kind of had some bigoted attitudes here. Need to sort of broaden my horizons a little bit.
Yeah, and Ice Cube too does yeoman work as well, sort of in the background, and he becomes sort of an attempt at a moral center of the film as well, driven by a religious a religious point of view, and I think that works thematically with the rest of the film. Yeah, I like this film. I don't think it's aged well. I think that there's still some aspects of this film that kind of separate. You know, it still kind of falls into the good Arab versus bad Arab tropes, and I don't always there are moments in this film when I'm like, oh, this is definitely a film written by Americans for an American audience that doesn't have all of the complexity that that films that this world deserves. And you know, if you watch actual cinema from the Arab world, I'm thinking of films like A Separation and the Insult. Those are films that do kind of deal with Arab affairs and Arab interrelations between Arabs in complex and interesting ways, because they're made authentically by, you know, Arab filmmakers. And so you run into this problem of politics of representation in Three Kings in ways that I'm not always comfortable with, yet the film's heart seems to be in the right place.
Yeah, I agree. There's a few moments where it feels maybe a little hammy, that like they're playing stuff up a little bit more for laughs, perhaps, rather than necessarily going for plausibility. And one of the other things I noticed that was strange was that even it's been 20 years since I've seen the film. I had a very accurate recollection of the first 45 minutes of the movie. And the second we hit that point, I was like, wait a minute. I don't remember anything that happens for the next hour of this film. And on the one hand, it was kind of nice because it was sort of like seeing a movie for the first time. But on the other hand, I sort of started to see why I'd sort of forgotten it, because you know, the second act is pretty, you know, most of the second act is kind of hollow. There is some good stuff in the second act, like the torture sequences, which were, like you mentioned before that, really good. But large chunks of it are just sort of, poorly executed action sequences overall. Sure. So it's, you know, it's telling to me that that I remembered the first part, the setup, the first act, and forgot the vast majority of the rest of it. I don't think I would say it falls prey to the good Arab, bad Arab. I actually don't think I mean, the only clearly bad Arab is Saddam, and he's never actually in the film. Everyone else is sort of shown, I think, and at least is somewhat sympathetic. I mean, even the sort of Saddam's agents, who are sort of nominally the bad guys, make it clear, like, look, if we do what you're telling us to do, then Saddam is going to kill us and he's going to kill our families, right. which makes them at least somewhat sympathetic, even though, as you say, they're not ever sort of fully fleshed out, which is somewhat unfortunate. But again, only so much time. You're trying to tell a story, you have certain limitations. Sure. So I don't think I can get on board with the good Arab, bad Arab per se. Even the quote unquote bad Arabs aren't really all that bad. And as I said, I think that the character that's probably the worst actually is an American character, not any of the Arab characters. So.
Yeah, I mean, I see your pushback, and I see the reason for your pushback. I can imagine somebody walking away with this with a rather simplistic reading of the Captain Saeed character and a rather simplistic view of the Amir Abdullah character, and finding those two to be sort of metonyms of two different sides of the intra-Iraq conflict. And so that's where I'm kind of finding this to be a little simplistic. So, you know, maybe I'm giving the film, maybe I'm being a little too harsh on the film, which I've been known to do. Yeah. So, what do we want? There's one other thing. Oh, I do wanted to mention just a quick thing. This was I saw this film when it came out, and I also saw this film when I went to paramedic school, because they played in my paramedic class the sucking chest wound scene, and that was apparently that is 100% accurate. in what a sucking chest wound is and how you treat it. So I found that to be interesting, that this is actually used in college classrooms to teach people how to handle sucking chest wounds. So shout out to Three Kings for its medical accuracy. If we ever do Doctor Strange and I go through all of the medical inaccuracies in Doctor Strange, then we'll sort of put these two in contest once again. So yes, this is medically accurate. Yes. All right. What do you give this film on 5?
3.5.
That's where I am. This is almost. This is on this podcast. We've been almost equal in both of our ratings. You gave 2.5 to Triple Frontier. I gave 2. We're both at 3.5 for Three Kings. Moving on to our news item. He's back. James Gunn has been reinstated as director of Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Garrett, this is the first news story that we covered for this podcast. We talked about James Gunn's ouster from the directing chair of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now he is back, and so what was your first reaction to this news?
Fuck yes. Yeah, no, this is something I've been hoping for a long time. I sort of felt it was a very long shot, but then as sort of the rumor mill started noting that they hadn't actually even been interviewing, or no, there'd been no leaks that such and such a person had been approached, and anytime there was one, so the person immediately shot it down and said, "No, I'm not in consideration. That's not for Guardians 3." It started to feel like it might be more and more plausible. So yeah, this was something that I was hoping for and was stoked to see it happen. Great news.
Yeah. I was my first reaction was I tweeted this out to our friend Steve Libby, Dirk Libby, who writes for Cinema Blend. He tweeted out the information that James Gunn has been reinstated, and I tweeted, "Shh, if we keep this quiet, then maybe the jerks who started this whole thing won't know it's happening." I was almost, every time I saw the internet blow up about James Gunn being reinstated, I'm like, don't tell Mike Cernovich, he'll freak out again, then we'll have to start over. But luckily, I don't know if this is a story that ever really penetrated into beyond film Twitter and beyond Twitter, and the sort of outrage machine that Twitter can sometimes become. So I don't think that this ever became a true cultural Me Too, Harvey Weinstein level event. And as a result of that, it increased James Gunn's likelihood of being reinstated. If this had become, national news to the point that it was a conversation topic all around, then I think that it would have been less likely. What is more, I think Disney kind of handled it rather slyly. They waited until the initial bonfire calmed down. They did their talks with James Gunn behind the scenes. And James Gunn did signed down for Suicide Squad 2. They kind of kept it underneath, and then on a week in which Captain Marvel is doing really quite well, and they release a new Endgame trailer. Oh, by the way, James Gunn's back. So they're sort of riding this wave of goodwill and have kind of been able to, in a public relations way, both do the right thing, but also do it in such a way that it doesn't garner as much outrage and attention as it might have if this were done, a week or two right after he was fired. So I think they handled it really slyly, and I think that was a wise public relations move on their part.
Yeah, part of me was wondering if, like, right after the blow up happened, if they went to James Gunn and said, "Look, we fucked up. We realize we fucked up. Here's the game plan. we're just going to let this cool down for a while. We're really sorry. We're going to rehire you in 6 months. Just don't say anything. Be cool about it. And so hopefully, with any luck, this will all blow over. And he agreed to that plan.
And stay the hell off of Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. But because if they didn't do that, if James Gunn wasn't sort of in on the plan, then god damn, that man has nerves of fucking steel. Because he didn't say a single thing negative about Disney, about the decision. He didn't lament his luck. He continued to take ownership of his prior shitty behavior and apologize for it. And was understanding and had the patience of just a Zen master. And I'm not saying that's impossible, but between those two scenarios, I think the first one just seems a little bit more plausible because, all due respect to James Gunn, but if that's how it went out, god damn respect for that man, because if I had been in his shoes and there hadn't been an agreement going on, you better bet your ass I'd be like, fuck Disney, you fucking screwed me over with this terrible decision. This was my project, I loved it, and now I don't get to do it. And shortly before he got fired, I remember he tweeted a picture of the cover page for the Guardians of the Galaxy 3 screenplay, and it said something like, 2 years of my heart. Was that?
I think it's every piece of my heart.
Every piece of my heart, right? Yeah. And to put something like that into a project and then to have it ripped away from you, I mean, that would have made me much less reasonable than James Gunn was. So either credit to Disney for figuring out early on how to handle it, or credit to James Gunn for having the nerves of steel, or possibly credit to both.
Right, and it's every bit of my heart is the actual tweet. He handled it relatively well. I think that his statement. Let me read his statement that he posted to Twitter. I am tremendously grateful to every person out there who has supported me over the past few months. I am always learning and will continue to work at being the best human being I can be. I deeply appreciate Disney's decision, and I am excited to continue making films that investigate the ties of love that bind us all. I have been and continue to be incredibly humbled by your love and support. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Love to you all. That's really quite nice. There's a lot of love in that statement. Just a number of times the word was mentioned, and in the sentiment as well. Although there's a comma missing, James. If you need a copy editor, let me know. So this is sort of a nice story and a nice little bookend to what was kind of an ugly situation. And the best thing about this, or one of the best things about this, I should say, is that we're probably going to get 2 good movies. We're going to get a Suicide Squad 2, which is being set, reports are that it's a hard reboot of a franchise that needs a hard reboot. Written and directed by James Gunn. We're going to get a Guardians of the Galaxy 3 written and directed by James Gunn. And he's working for both Marvel and DC. So it kind of puts to rest this whole Marvel versus DC fanboy war, which is good for the clicks, but probably doesn't really exist in the actual industry. So I think this is a nice sort of end to the story, and I'm glad that it happened.
I'm a little less optimistic about Suicide Squad 2. Suicide Squad 1 I thought was an absolutely abysmally horrible film. So it is a little bit more reassuring to hear that it's a hard reboot, if that rumor turns out to be true. And of course, James Gunn is an excellent writer and director. So it would be hard for Suicide Squad 2 to be worse than the first one.
Right.
At the same time, I feel that, and it's going to be at least significantly circumscribed by its source material. And it's not just that the movie is bad; the source material is bad. Suicide Squad as a concept is just something that's crap. So I look forward to being proven wrong about that. I've been wrong before. I thought it was a terrible idea to bring back the Joker in the Batman franchise, but Nolan proved me completely wrong on that one. So wow. I am hoping I will be eating my words on this in a year or whatever when Suicide Squad 2 comes out. And, you know, in a certain way, I'm almost sort of emphasizing it here precisely. So if I'm wrong, I will be happy to eat these words, to eat crow. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't think that even James Gunn can save that property. But
well, we will see. We'll review that. We'll make sure that that's one of our reviews. We'll put it on the spreadsheet for 5 years or 2 years from now, however long it comes out. Right. So I guess we're so let's anything else about James Gunn before we jump away?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. So next week, we've got sort of a stacked list, a stacked weekend of films. Our sister podcast, Deadly Analysis, will be going on Sunday with Requiem for a Dream. Then on Tuesday, we will be doing Paddleton, another Netflix film, another film that I'll be probably talking about whether or not you should have it while you're doing the dishes. And we'll be pairing that with our movie club entry 50/50, the Joseph Gordon-Levitt film. Came out a few years ago. So until then, I'm Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this has been
Jim and Garrett
Movies. Good night.